Okay.
Richie. You should be expecting the first time.
All right, let's get rolling. So good morning and welcome back. I hope that you all have had a good weekend. We are now in week number 2, and hopefully your schedule has really started to settle in and you're really starting to feel like you're getting a pace of your courses and everything else. I'm glad to have folks back. I also appreciate you all taking the time to complete the week number 1 quiz. Like just about everybody did that. We'll continue to have those quizzes each week that are open note and open book. Again, it's not designed to trick you. It's designed to help you as you're working through. We will shift gears for today, and we're going to be taking some time to talk about the core of interviewing, which is questions. So we'll be taking time today to talk about how we're able to develop and ask questions effectively. Since you'll be doing a variety of interview types in this class, it's crucial for us to develop those skills so that you can use good questions and understand some of the purpose and utility of interview questions as well. So last class, we took some time to talk about some of the different things that shape interviews, both verbally and non-verbally, things such as the use of space, the way that you might even arrange tables and desks to make an interview feel comfortable between parties, the way that you build rapport and good connections between people, right? We looked at an example of a Hot Wings episode where we're able to see how comfort develops over time. And then we looked at how some of those different parts, things such as eye contact, facial expressions, and so on, convey the level of comfort and interest that people have. So you might recall this larger model here that looks at some of the roles of interviewer and interviewee, interactions, the role of the 2 different parties, right? So one multiple choice question that a couple people struggled with is an interview can have more than 2 people, right? But it can only have 2 parties. In other words, party is a group or individual with a stake or interest in the interview process, right? So a party could be a committee who is looking to hire somebody for a job, and then the other party is the person who is applying for that job, right? So more than 2 people, but only 2 parties. We talked about how things such as the perception process shape our understanding of what's unfolded in an interview too. You could feel like an interview went great, but maybe an employer thinks that you're not the best candidate for the position. So there can be a bit of miscommunication there, right? Communication is never one-to-one. There's always noise, subtext, things that are left out between people. Is there anybody that's here for the first time today? Okay. Oh, well, you're face-to-face anyway. Welcome. We'll give you the chance to introduce yourself, share your name, major, and something you did over spring break.
My name is Angela, and I'm a health and human performance major, and something I did over spring break was that I went back home to Hawaii.
Awesome. Well, we are glad to have you here and glad you made it. Angela has been enjoying us remotely this past week, so glad to have you back face to face. Again, if you ever have any sort of urgent travel issue, you're not able to get around safely, or you're feeling sick, let me know and I can send you a link for that meeting. So for today, we're going to be looking at some of the roles of questions in the interviewing process, the different types of questions that can be asked in interviews, and some of the pitfalls, right, or challenges of questions. And this is useful for us in 2 different respects, right? Inevitably in our lives, we're going to be tasked with developing interviews, whether it's developing like a survey for people in the context of like digital management or production, whether it's conducting a face-to-face interview for somebody like for a job or seeking out information, right? We're going to have to develop a skill set. And one of the things that's really useful for us is when we're being asked to interview questions, we can better understand why we're being asked those questions, right? So someone is looking at us for a job and they're asking, tell me why you want this job, right? You're not going to respond and say money, right? They are asking for your motivations, your interests, your goals that might be a little bit more in depth than that. So some quick housekeeping for the day. Quiz number 2 is available and due on Sunday, right? Quiz number 2 covers content from chapters 3 and 4 of the Stewart textbook, which we'll be going over today. So you will need to secure some version of the textbook. Again, I highly recommend renting the Amazon ebook for about $33. It's pretty affordable. You can also get access from the bookstore or order an online copy. If you know that you're not able to get a copy of the book in order to complete the quiz, please let me know and I can help you out with securing something to complete the week's assignment. Just know that you do need that copy this week. So we took some time last week to discuss the interview analysis essay. Remember, this is an assignment where I'm asking you to think about and look at an interview that might exist out in the world. It could be something like 60 Minutes, could be a YouTube series. It could be an interview with a celebrity or major figure. It could be a late night show, right? The idea here is that you're looking at how the interview is unfolding, the strategies that are being used between parties, and applying some of those fundamentals that we're talking about in the class to that. We also have our first in-class interviews that we will be doing during the 4th week of the term. You'll notice that there are 4 days that are blocked out, week 4 and a little bit into week 5. What I will be doing this week is circulating a Google form for you. I like to wait until this point in the term to do that because I know for a lot of you who are traveling or involved in extracurriculars, you have schedules that are still kind of settling in, right? So you'll notice that between these 4 days, you'll be slotted into a partnership on one of those 4 days and asked to work with that partner. And you'll alternate between being the person asking the questions and the person answering the questions. So I'll circulate that form this week. I'll assign people into partnerships, and then you will be giving the survey interview on that day. We'll also be going over the rubric and expectations for the survey interview, so you know exactly what you need to do to prepare. Just know that for this interview, I'll ask you going in to have an interview guide that we'll be discussing this week as basically a set of questions and structure to the interview, and also asking you to develop a brief, which is your preparation to being asked questions, right? What are the responses and ideas that you have developed so that you can prepare effectively? So just know that that is coming up, and that the purpose of the Google form is to make sure that you are scheduled to be in a partnership and to give an interview at a time that works within your schedule and any sort of travel constraints that you have. So look forward to that. Any questions on anything related to the course so far, the structure, anything that's coming up at this point? Great. Questions do come up at any point, please let me know. And I look forward to getting into the role of questions. So I think it's a good idea when we're looking at questions and interviews to think about some of the different types of questions, some of the ways that we can utilize probing and the follow-up questions, and then some of the pitfalls and challenges regarding the use of questions, right? If we're thinking about the goal, if we're trying to acquire information about somebody, we're trying to figure out how somebody is doing, right? We're trying to seek out information about their health. We're trying to figure out if they're a good fit for a job, right? Having the questions prepared that are the right ones that help us get at those issues is crucial. I've been in a lot of interviews where there are a lot of bad types of questions. For instance, the use of double-barreled questions, the use of loaded questions that we'll talk about in a minute that do not get at the information that people really want, or that assume answers or push people toward answers that are not entirely accurate. So one of the first ways that we can think about the questioning process is the use of open-ended questions, right? The use of an open question is generally one that is inviting a variety of different types of responses, right? So there's not one right or wrong, yes or no answer. You can't just answer in a word. So one really good example is to say, tell me about your phone, right? And you might notice that that does not end with a question mark. When we're talking about questions in the context of an interview, right? A question for an interview does not necessarily need to end with a question mark, right? So it can be an interview question, even if it's just a statement, like tell me about your phone, or tell me about your previous work experience, because it is inviting a specific response here. So an open question is a really good way to figure out people's attitudes, their beliefs. It's a good way to help people to, if you're looking for a response that's catering to the interviewee's interests, right? What is the first thing that they say when they hear their phone? Well, maybe they're really thinking about like this cool new camera they have that works really well. Or maybe they're like really into the animojis and like the silly filters for their phone, right? So what is it that makes them interested in their phone when they hear that? Maybe that's something that you really want to know. So open questions are great for gathering interest, for figuring out some of the values and ideas behind people, but they can be really time intensive, right? You are inviting somebody to take a lot of time to respond to a question. For instance, if you ask somebody, tell me about your previous work experience, they could go into a 15-minute monologue where they talk about all the drama and all of their old jobs. That can be a challenge. So one way that you can offset this is to take some time to explore ways to pare down if people are rambling, they're getting off topic, right? So you want to be careful about the time that you have available to ask these types of questions, knowing that they can take a lot more real estate. We have a moderately open question, right? So a question can be very open, but a little bit less open would be, tell me about some of the features of your phone. You're still letting people pick what the features are. Maybe they're really interested in talking about the camera, but maybe they're not going to talk about the phone case, or maybe they're not going to talk about the process of going to the store to get it. So you are putting some boundaries on that, which is good if there are specific things that you're interested in. So maybe it's not just tell me about your work experience, tell me about your relevant work experience, right? So somebody's not telling like a horror story about the first time that they worked at a McDonald's and like they burned their hand on the grill, right? So it's a good way to narrow the scope. And then a closed question is one that is seeking a very specific answer, right? It's a lot more closed-ended. Generally speaking, a good way to think about closed questions is that it's an interview question that could be answered in a sentence. And sometimes it can just be answered in a word, right? So if you were to say, what type of phone do you have? Well, an answer would be like a iPhone 9 mini, right? So being able to provide a closed question is a really good way to ensure that you're getting the specific information that you need. How long have you been working in sales? So maybe you need things that you just can't get from other sources. One challenge is to ask yourself in a closed interview question, is this information that I can only get from the interviewee, or is this information I can get somewhere else, right? One big trap if you're interviewing somebody for a job is to ask them a question that's already on their job application or already on the resume, right? So one trick is making sure the closed questions make sense. And by the way, over the course of an interview, you're generally not going to only use one of these types, right? You're usually going to alternate between open and closed questions and styles in order to better engage with the interests of the person you're interviewing and figure out answers to the questions you're looking for, right? So these questions can be highly closed, which is considered very, very narrow. Tell me the model of your phone, right, would be an example of really narrowing things down. We also have what are known as bipolar questions, right? Think about like two poles, north and south pole, right? Typically, a bipolar question is asking somebody to pick between two options, right? So if the options available for dinner are pizza and pasta, do you want pizza or pasta for dinner? Bipolar questions can be good if you're seeking out specific information. So for instance, maybe there's a job that's more about sales and there's a job that's more about tech. Of those two, which are you the better fit for, right? If you have limited options, this can be a good thing. But you want to be careful here, right? Because asking a bipolar question, if somebody's response does not fit in those two categories, it's not really invited. So for instance, if somebody were to say, are you a Republican or a Democrat? Well, somebody might be an independent, right? So being careful about how you're structuring your responses is important here. So you might think about when it's appropriate to choose an open-ended question, when you really want people as an interviewee to guide the discussion, to really bring it up in the context of their interests, right? You might choose a close-ended question when you're really interested in just getting facts. And it's a good idea to use a combination through different styles and formats. We'll talk a little bit more on Wednesday about the funnel style, where you generally move from a much more open-ended style of question to a much more closed-ended style of question. And by the way, these types of questions can be really useful, not only when you're doing like a face-to-face interview, but if you find yourself designing a survey, right, or conducting an experiment, or you find yourself involved in something like tech sector and you're doing like customer satisfaction survey. I had a job where I was spending a good amount of time asking customer satisfaction survey questions, and it was for an energy company. And generally speaking, the quality of service was not great. So the questions were generally both open and closed-ended. They gave an opportunity for people to express their grievances and frustrations, but I was also asked by my employer to use like scale type questions, like how likely are you to recommend our company, 1 to 5? So that range was something that employers were looking at. I wanted to share a clip that highlights an example here of how open and closed-ended questions can be utilized, and a few different examples of how they can be applied to settings, including surveys.
I have a question for you. What is your favorite book genre? Now that you've mentally answered, let me ask once more, but a bit different. Which of the following is your favorite book genre? Did your answer change? These two questions are examples of the two variations of these research questions we have. Open-ended or closed-ended. Closed-ended questions have a limited set of possible answers, but they allow you to analyze the responses a bit easier. Closed-ended questions are great for quantitative usability studies or surveys. Some examples of closed-ended questions include, has this happened before? Which of the following do you own? Overall, this task was on a scale 1, very difficult, to 7, very easy. On the other hand, open-ended questions are great because they allow for free-form answers like lists and stories. One downside of asking open-ended questions is that it can be difficult and more time-consuming to quantify responses from open-ended questions. Open-ended questions are great for exploratory studies like usability testing, interviews, qualitative surveys, field studies, or diary studies. Here are some examples of open-ended questions. What do you think about that? What would you expect to happen if you click that? What would you most want to change about this process? When we conduct research studies, we're in a very curious mindset. We want to find out everything we can about our participants and their experience with our interface. Questions are a great way to get pointed insights, but the way you ask questions matters. Both closed and open-ended questions have their place in user research. Open-ended questions give us insight, but closed-ended questions give us metrics and scale. Knowing when to use each type of question is key to getting the data you need.
So it's kind of the difference between qualitative and quantitative, right? Qualitative is very much about the information that you can't easily transfer and move around, but it is valuable in its own right. Quantitative is more generalizable. So if somebody asks you a Gallup poll, they're going to ask you, like, do you approve or disapprove of this political leader? But they're also going to ask you questions about some of the topics you see as the most important, like ranking order, or they might be asking you to share your perspective on a given topic. So we have what are known as both primary and probing questions. And this is really crucial here because sometimes you ask a question and you are not going to get the response that you're interested in. Or sometimes you find in a line of questioning that there's something incredibly interesting. Great, let's build on this, right? So a primary question you can think about in this way. You take the question out of the interview, does the question still make sense? So for instance, asking questions such as, what is your major? Well, that question works, right? It hangs together even if you don't have that happen in an interview, right? We oftentimes use primary questions as a way of changing topics, areas of focus, and helping to really make sure that we understand on both parties what the line of questioning is about. You know you're probably going to get more questions related to your major, why you chose your major. So primary question is a good starting point, right? So one of the most crucial skills of good interviewing is probing, right? You can ask somebody a question and say, okay, what is your major? And they say health and human performance. Okay, great. But there might be a whole lot you want to dig into with that. Why did they choose that major? Tell me more, right? So you use things such as statements, very short brief questions. So interesting. Okay, right? As a way of trying to get people to share a little bit more about the topic. A good interview is one in which an interviewer is identifying a possible thread that they can tease a little bit more. So for instance, they might say, yeah, after my trip to Barcelona, I really realized I was interested in health. Okay, great, right? Tell me about this trip to Barcelona. That seems like it was a really interesting and impactful experience. You think back to Friday, right? Jenna Ortega was being asked questions about like working with Tim Burton, about like the aesthetics and way that the show Wednesday was developed. Like that's interesting stuff that only she could answer. So really pointing to and building off of that thread is important. So probing is a way of letting the interview evolve naturally, using more than just the hard-coded questions that you have, but instead using interpersonal communication, right? We think about how we communicate well with each other. Well, we ask questions, we explore, we get into topics that aren't necessarily what we had prepared or expecting in the conversation going in, right? So in the same way, an interview is a way to really find those things that are interesting. My advice is to follow the spark, right? You notice that there's a spark, there's something exciting, somebody lights up as they're talking about something, or you realize that there's something that's really fascinating that you really want to get into in more detail. Take the time to explore and get into more detail about it. Now, this is in the context of interviews that allow things to be open-ended and developed in that way, right? If you are asking interview questions and you have to follow, for instance, the guidelines of a state or a federal entity, then the use of that line of questioning doesn't really work. So I encourage you to be careful about what the requirements are. Like if you're doing a survey and you can only answer, you can only ask a very specific set of questions, make sure you're abiding by that. But if you're asked to acquire information in a more open-ended way, follow-up questions can be great. So there are a few different ways that you can utilize probes effectively. One of them is to use the use of silent, nonverbal communication. This is really common in the context of therapy and mental health professionals, right? For instance, therapists will oftentimes use silence when somebody is sharing a concern or thought to get them to share more, right? So they say, oh, I've been having a really hard time. I don't really know what I'm doing with my life. And the therapist says nothing, they're paying attention, they're being attentive. And then the person speaks more and talks about, well, why they don't know what they're doing with their lives, right? So using probes is a really good way to help things develop. Also using things such as nudging, right? Offering a short statement or fragment as a way of encouraging people to continue to discuss. Okay, I see. Tell me more. Nudging can be a great way to get to that. Or sometimes you have people who are not actually answering the question. Right? So they beat around the bush or they didn't understand the question. It's a way to redirect. One of the most useful lines of questioning that you can do is what's called a clearinghouse probe, right? Or clearinghouse question. Clearinghouse is really good as a way to wrap up an interview. It's also a really good way to make sure that if there are things people wanted to share that they weren't able to get in the line of interviewing questions, that they're still able to get that. So for an example of a clearinghouse probe, you might ask, so we've talked a whole lot about your previous work experience. Is there anything else that you would like us to know? That can be a really good way to make sure that the person who has these ideas that they weren't able to get in the other questions can set the agenda. Informational probes, right? Seeking more insight, right? So maybe somebody is talking about their experience working at a previous job and you say, okay, well, how long did you work there? Right? You might need more context. Or somebody uses an abbreviation. They talk about their OHA, right? What is the OHA? Tell me about what this is. Restating the question, right, is asking the question in a different way. This is, again, really useful if somebody is not really directly answering the question or you find that they're a bit distracted, right? And then there's what's known as a reflective probe. This is when you, as an interviewer, summarize what the interviewee has said. So let me see if I've got this right. You move to Eastern Oregon and you're feeling a lot of stress because you're in an entirely new area where you don't really have close friends or connections. And then the use of probes, it can be really helpful in terms of understanding and relating to people. But if you probe too much, right, you ask too many types of follow-up questions, or you're using strategies to push people, sometimes they clam up. Sometimes people feel like they're being pushed outside of their comfort zone or being forced to answer questions that they don't really know the answers to. So that can be a challenge to effective interviewing too. Another factor to consider here is the role of bias on the part of an interviewer, right? A neutral question, generally speaking, shouldn't have what seems to be a correct answer. So if somebody were to say a question along the lines of, hey, you want pizza, which is amazing. I hear there's this great place across the street. Like, you know, do you want pasta or something, right? They're presenting a question in a way that really leads you toward a response based on meeting the needs or expectations of others, right? A leading question is implying a correct or wanted answer, right? So in other words, a leading question might be suggesting something such as, well, you're going to EOU, right? Or you're considering EOU as the college to go to. So I think it's important for you to take a step back, right? Think about your own background, your own perspective and lived experience, and the way that that experience is shaping the way that you engage in the interviewing process. So be careful about your own background, your bias, and what you're bringing into the interview. If you're coming in from a particular bent or opinion, sometimes it's good to share that early on and make sure that both parties know that. Other times it's a good idea to be as neutral as possible, right? We don't want to bake or assume responses or lead people to answer questions in a particular way. Because oftentimes in an interview, people are going to want to answer questions the way that they think you want them to be answered. Again, when I did customer satisfaction surveys, I had a whole lot of people who said, well, you're not going to like my answers, or, you know, I don't have a whole lot of good things to say about this company. But that wasn't the point, right? We wanted the good and the bad. We wanted a full understanding of how the company was. So the interviewing process was a crucial way to get a full understanding, even if people thought that bad responses didn't count. If you played Animal Crossing, there's a pitfall item that you can do that makes you fall into a pit, which is kind of fun. And in the same way, right, you flail around, you can feel upset and frustrated if you fall into a question pitfall in an interview. So there are a variety of different traps and problems that an interview can run into, right? So one of the traps is what's known as the bipolar trap. That is, when there is a question that should be a what or a how or a why question, but instead you're framing it as like a yes/no question. So could you explain a little bit about your background? Yes, I could. I could explain a bit about my background. Do you want me to? Right. So that, of course, you're kind of being obnoxious. Or like growing up, my dad would always do this. So somebody would ask him, for instance, hey, do you want to make the bed? No, I don't want to make the bed. I will, but that's not the question. You're asking me if I want to, right? So people can be a little bit obnoxious for sure, but framing questions with clarity using a why or a how. For instance, asking a question along the lines of, why do you want to make the bed? Well, it'll help make sure that I have a cleaner space. So tell me everything. Like asking an incredibly broad question like that, right, can be a big challenge because oftentimes you are making the net too wide and you're going to get a lot of irrelevant information, right? It's like you cast too big of a fishing net, you get a whole bunch of junk and seaweed if you're trying to catch your fish. An open to close switch. So one thing you got to be careful about is asking a question and then asking a question immediately after that undercuts your first question. Right. So a really good example of this would be to say something like, oh, did you go to Paris? Did you see the Eiffel Tower? Right. Where you are narrowing it down overly in a way that hurts the response, because suddenly the interviewee is not going to be talking about their overall experience in Paris. They're just going to be talking about the Eiffel Tower. So you have missed out on the open-endedness that you set up with your original question. We got to make room for silence in order to prevent our interview scope from being too narrow. Another thing is to use a double barred question, right? So this can be a challenge if you are presenting like too many parts of the question, because sometimes people will forget or not fully address the question. So for instance, tell me about your experiences in primary school and middle school, right? Well, maybe there's a lot in primary school, a lot in middle school, but asking them to talk about both, they're maybe only going to focus on one of the two. So be careful to split up questions that are asking two different things. So don't push people through the use of leading questions, right? Again, a leading question can invite somebody to respond in a way based on what they think they want the response to be. Another thing is to avoid something being a guessing game, right? So how old are you? Like 33, 34, right? That's probably not relevant when you can instead ask, what is your age? How old are you, right? So try to avoid turning things into a guessing game that can be a weird back and forth. Yes, no response, right? So oftentimes, yes, no questions are good when you're seeking very specific information. Would you recommend us to a friend? But the yes, no response can be a very quick way to shut it down, right? So, you know, was school good? Yes or no, right? You might want to ask a more open-ended question. A quiz show, right, where you're like quizzing people and asking them questions that like are more about useless information, or more like asking questions that are for your own curiosity. Oh, okay, so you worked over in Hermiston. Did you ever go to this place, right? That just might be a question that doesn't connect to the topic at hand. And then focusing on clarity, right? Don't ask an overly complex question. Generally speaking, if you have to use more than one comma to phrase your question, you're using too many clauses in the question, it's probably not a good choice. And then there's also what's known as a don't ask, don't tell question. In other words, asking questions that are designed to be like a test, like I'm not supposed to answer this, I see you. Or a question that is intentionally like uncomfortable or illegal or outside the boundaries of what should be asked. I'll give you one example, right? Generally speaking, it is illegal to ask somebody questions about if they have or would intend to have kids, right? Or their pregnancy status. In kind of the academic world, right? That is a major no-no to ask somebody like, hey, are you pregnant? Are you planning on having kids? Right? That'd be incredibly inappropriate. And those types of questions oftentimes still are asked, even though they're illegal and not supposed to be asked. So sometimes people find themselves in a bind where they say, do I answer this question that I know that I'm not supposed to answer? Or do I avoid that knowing that this is a test and that if I refuse to answer that I'm going to have better support? So that can be a challenge, right? Is making sure the questions that you're asking are appropriate. So given some of those things, for group attendance activity, I want us to be doing some work to understand and unpack the role of questions in the interview process. So I'm going to be putting you into groups. And what I'll ask is that you have one person in your group who writes or types to turn in for attendance credit. And I'm tasking you to develop a set of recruitment interview questions for a high school student who's interested in coming to EOU, right? Your goal over the course of this interview is to figure out their plans and try to convince them to enroll as an EOU student. As a group, I want you to take the time to develop at least 10 questions that you would ask this student. And as you're developing these questions, I want you to include at least one of each of these types, which are open-ended, closed-ended, bipolar, and clearinghouse. And in your attendance prompt, make sure that you're labeling which is following into those categories. Once you've had the chance to develop a set of questions, I want you to consider some of the pitfalls of questions, right? How is your set of questions avoiding some of the problems that we've talked about in the class? Lastly, I want you to think about how your questions align with the type of interview that you're being asked to do, right? So how do your questions align with doing a recruitment interview? Why does it make sense for you to ask those questions when your goal is to recruit somebody for EOU? So let's go ahead and do a group of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. We'll do a group of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. We'll do a group of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. We'll do a group of 1, 2, 3, and 4. We'll do a group of 1, 2, 3, and 4. So take some time, share each other's names, and then have one person write or type as we talk and work through these parts of the problem.
Oh, yeah, I know.
There's, you said Audrey?
Yeah.
Okay.
You were like, now I can be a yes. Well, we want to start with an open.
Yeah. So many time questions. First question, what is your name? What is that? What is your name?
What? What is your name?
For high school students. I know it doesn't have a name.
When open it, be like, yeah.
So is your interest in nature?
Yeah, or like, yeah. What kind of interest do you have?
What's that? Do we already know their name?
No.
Well, okay, I think we need both. We need to establish what the major is and the.
Let's see.
How could the process get there?
You want to know where they're from?
Tell me about your interest. Are you interested in anything else?
What are your academic interests? The first one, what's your guess? Yeah. What is your biological?
Or you get. Yeah. So there should be 10 questions. A lot of stuff. A lot of the questions.
If you had to choose. No, if you had
We can say like, we could ask like,
You like, yeah? Like, what are some of your interests?
like academically or extracurricular?
You always have one.
We have 10 questions. Yeah.
Do you like nature? Are you interested in outdoor activities? Yeah.
If so, what activity?
No, you tell me about that. But if they don't tell me about. Right? Are you interested in maybe? How do I see? But if you said so.
Like after you have to share more? Yeah, like. Tell me more.
Oh. Add what has been this. What may have been. That's a good thing. Over 4.
Picking between these things, like you can say like. To be like, are you more interested in sports or academics? I just had to get like, are you more interested in sports or academics?
You like, you are. If we just say, tell me about it. Wait, that could be. Did you stop? At the very end, question 10.
We should have.
Question 10. Start with 10.
Yeah,
How you doing?
I know, and-
We have about 5 more minutes. You might transition into talking about parts 2 and 3.
Wait, we're trying to recruit. So what?
Well, how do you do? I thought we were like. We
Like,
could try to know.
made you like something? I can see how did you know where the. You prefer.
What, how did you figure it? Yeah, what do
Drug issue. So you're really really high school.
you could ask them to like, what do they like about
Where they haven't been here. But then, we can't just have like. Do you prefer a large campus feel or small? You, a big, small, small?
We're all done.
No, because people are like, you can make it small. So you can make it feel.
Are you interested
Oh, well, you need what they.
And that's just
We want to talk about the city.
There's nothing to talk about.
Oh, I know.
There's nothing to talk about. That's gonna turn them away. What do you know about you?
Oh, we have to be open-ended, right?
Yeah.
Oh, we have to be first. I think we're trying to. Yeah, but do we want to have like a first? Since the last. Or easy. Like, so- We're looking more at like,
Let's talk about dinner. What are your plans? What are your Domino's? You like Domino's?
we got pizza cards.
What are your plans? Always. Yeah, but like, are they? You don't know. I plan to. I plan to take a gap year.
You want a job immediately?
We got Domino's.
Yeah, we got Domino's. We got pizza cards. You wanted to talk.
Wait, what else? Wait, what else? What else?
What if, how many questions do you have?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Be like, no, what was the question? Tell me about yourself.
Take about 2 more minutes.
You say like, do you have any, do you have any plans for the future? Like, you have to.
What are your future aspirations?
Have you?
Because we asked what their issues are like, what do you like degrees in?
Are you?
Say like, look at the, how are you?
Dude, if it's a question, she said, yeah. I love her. He said, yeah, I love her. No, good point.
Honestly, the meeting is going like an hour.
No, because if they say, then you say, what's the date?
No, I'm just.
I know. Yeah. What group are you going for? That's what. That's high school.
So go ahead and finish your discussion.
We talk about how it's cheaper.
Oh, are you aware? It's small, student capacity ratio 40. Very small. Talk about the acceptance. It's 90.
Okay. So let's take some time to talk about this together. As I was hovering around and hearing from the groups, it seemed like there was really good brainstorming, folks talking about their own experiences in EOU as kind of a way of thinking about how they might set up and ask these questions. Ferris also asked a good question. Do we know the student's name? Which was no. So you might be developing a set of questions out of students that you might reach out to, but when you're working with a specific student, you might seek out things such as their name. So what I'd like to do is have us go around. Let's start with the group here in the front. What is an open-ended question that you had for this interview?
So, one of the ones we picked are, what are your academic interests?
Okay, yeah, so this is kind of like a moderately open one, right? So a very open-ended question is, what are your interests? Moderately open-ended would be, what are your academic interests, right? So that's a good way of gauging like what people might want to major in, or what like department or program might be a good fit. So the group back here, what is a close-ended question?
So are you interested in?
Yes, are you interested in attending college, right? That would be a good yes or no question. You might consider how somebody might follow up to that one. So if somebody says no, maybe you're like, okay, well, what are you thinking about instead? Or, what is kind of what you see as your path or goal? If somebody says yes, you might kind of go down the path of being like, well, where are you considering? So think about it like a flow chart, right? Where they say yes, you go down this path. If they say no, they go down this path. So that's one way that like closed-ended questions can be useful, is they help you to figure out what you want to ask next. How about a bipolar question?
Would the bipolar question be like a yes or no type thing? Like there's a limited selection of options for it, so you can only go a couple directions with it.
Sure.
I think one of ours was, would you be interested in living on campus or off campus?
Great. Yeah, right. On or off campus, right? By is two. So two choices, on or off campus, right? That's a good way to figure out their interests as well. And then how about over here in the front? What is a clearinghouse question?
We asked what type of environment you would invest in response. We also put in how do you help you achieve this?
Okay, sure. So if a lot of your line of questioning is about developing a sense of the environment they want, that can work really well. Remember that a clearinghouse question is kind of like trying to wrap up the entire interview. So you might go a little bit broader for a clearinghouse question and say, is there anything else you'd like to know about the environment here? Or something like that. But you're on the right track. So what is a pitfall that you avoided through your questions? Let's hear from the group back here. Okay.
Get rid of sort of the like quizzing, but also the
Sure. Right. So what is appropriate to ask a student, like high school student who's going to become UU, right? Like asking them, hey, are you in a relationship? Are you planning on going to the same school as the person you're dating, right? That would be something to mix, but figuring out what their goals are, why they're interested in choosing a location, they might share that information on their own. And let's go back here to the group in the front. How did the questions that you all chose fit for recruitment?
So we first kind of strategy is get to know the person.
Mhm.
And then since we are recruiting for college, our questions are kind of based around our college specifically, whether they like tight knit communities, and we're kind of trying to shape the questions in a way where it shed positive light on our campus and what we have to offer. So instead of saying, do you like a big school or a small school, we'll say, do you like a large school or do you like a school with more tight knit community? Because small can associate with that for a lot of people. So we kind of formed our questions to show the positives of our school and what our kind of surroundings have to offer.
So one challenge to that is that it can be presented as a loaded question. You want one of those big schools where you don't even know anybody. You want like a very tight knit, closely connected school. But I like that you're speaking to developing good relationships at EOU and how like you can kind of advertise the specifics, right? So asking a question that invites you to speak to the strengths of EOU is a good way that you're able to utilize some of those skills. So I wanted to do this activity to get us thinking about the types of questions. If you struggled a bit to figure out good questions or you second guess or like, oh, that doesn't really work as a question. I thought it did, but it's closed-ended, right? We'll be doing a lot more of this in class. Asking good questions is difficult, it takes time, but it's a skill set we'll continue to develop over time. So we talked a little bit about some of the types, styles, and strategies of asking questions. So we'll continue to explore some of that this week. Next class, we'll be getting into structuring interviews. How do you put these questions in a good way that makes sense? How do you arrange them? And use things such as interview guides to help with your structure as well. So please make sure your group member names are on the activity you completed today. Please pass forward or email me your group activity. Have a great rest of your morning, and I will see you again on Wednesday. Thanks.
I just don't